I think about absurdism a lot. Absurdism is a movement that came out of existentialism and is often linked to writers such as Franz Kafka, but also to the writer Albert Camus, Camus of which is an author that I think about all of the time. And I think about absurdism because absurdism is this idea in philosophy basically that everything is meaningless. We're trying to figure out what the point of existence is when there's no objective meaning to be found. And you end up in a world where things feel very nihilistic, and what you're trying to do, such as in the Myth of Sisyphus by Camus, is figure out what is the point, what is the meaning, what do you do, and what are your next steps in terms of figuring out how to live in this world and live in, as Sartre might describe, this unfathomable universe. And that's why I love absurdism, because I think it captures this intense tension between the meaning that we hope to find in life and the meaning that we struggle to find, and our confrontation with the universe itself and this realization of the meaninglessness that is around us. And so absurdism comes out of existentialism and is very much an attempt to try to figure out what is the meaning, what is the point. A book that I think captures absurdism perfectly and might actually be the quintessential text of absurdism, with the exception of Metamorphosis by Franz Kafka, would be The Fall by Albert Camus. Now, The Fall is actually a very short book, and it's fairly readable in terms of its actual length, and yet I would say that the book is actually very complex. I would add that the book definitely requires you to think, and even though the writing might seem very direct, there's actually a lot of subtext to the writing itself, such as you find in the work The Stranger by Camus as well. And so Camus is a very interesting writer, who I've actually talked about before on my Philosopher series, and I've talked about him because I think that he's very much, he's possibly my favorite existentialist and definitely one of my favorite writers, because of the way that he wrestles with ambiguity and how he captures this very almost depressive perspective in a universe that makes no sense, and yet captures it through very beautiful language and through philosophical ideas. Now, what I would say about this book, The Fall, is that it very much features this front and center approach to absurdism, with trying to figure out what is meaning, what is the point, what is the purpose of life. And I will admit, I actually thought this book was going to contain wisdom in a very kind of almost traditionally philosophical sense, where it might have Socratic wisdom. But one thing I loved about this book was the way that it actually turned that kind of wisdom seeking on its head. Because actually what you find out is that the main character who is narrating this book and describing his story is very much hypocritical. He is a hypocrite. And that's why this book is called The Fall, because this character is very much doubtful. You don't trust this character. You're not sure what this character is even getting at most of the time. And I love that reversal, because I actually turned to Camus partly to see this kind of wisdom in his writing after really enjoying The Stranger, and yet what I realize is that he turns it on its head by really looking at philosophy through this kind of different lens, and by capturing it through narrative, by capturing it through a story. And I think that that's a super interesting way of writing a book. Now, to make a long story short, the book features a character named, I believe, Clements is how you pronounce it, and he is a lawyer, and basically he's trying to understand his life and the context of his life. But the reason why it's called The Fall is because he's talking about his virtue and talking about all of these things he's trying to do. But then it ends in a very dark and brutal way whenever there's the revelation that he did not actually protect a woman who jumped to her death. And this is where I think the book is incredibly insightful and impactful in the way that it captures this sense of futility in the face of reality, in the face of morality, in the face of existence, in the face of ethics. And I think that's why this book is powerful. What I think the book does really well in capturing these ideas is dealing with this notion that we are all hypocritical. We're basically all complicit. And this is an idea that is actually very unforgiving in general and on its face, because it's an idea that shows that we all are culpable whenever it comes to being moral and ethical, that life is actually very much more gray and ambiguous, and how terrifying of a reality that can actually be. Because you have this individual who's talking about his understanding of his morality, only to realize where he fell short. And the book is not necessarily a condemnation of this individual character, but more a condemnation of how humans act. Humans are complicit. Humans are ineffective. Humans are, in a way, unable to change anything, and sometimes even choose that directly. And that's a very interesting idea, one that I don't think is easy to stomach, but I think it's definitely an important idea and one to consider. And so the arc of this story is very interesting, because even though you could argue that it is modeled off like the religious idea of the fall, it's actually very much an atheistic approach in line with Camus, of this idea that we all let each other down. We all find this meaninglessness through our actions and this futility of our ability to change anything. And I think that's where it's really powerful. I think that's where the book shines. It is a very dark idea, but like The Stranger by Camus, it was never meant to be comforting. And like I said, this is what I learned with reading the book, which is that very much it's not comforting. It's not meant to be comforting. It's meant to provoke. It's meant to evoke ideas that you might normally resist, and it's definitely meant to get you to think. So you might be wondering what this has to do with absurdism. Well, absurdism is really this confrontation with the absurd. It's this idea that nothing makes sense, and that nothing matters, that everything is nihilistic, that there's no purpose, there's no meaning. And this is a very dark idea, but I think it's a perfect idea to explore, not just in philosophy, but also literature. I think it's a great thing to explore, to figure out what do we do with this absurdity that we are constantly confronting. It seems to me that that is definitely one of the things to think about then, which is, what is the purpose? What do we do if we're constantly falling short? What do we do if we're constantly taking part of a fall? What do we do if we're constantly struggling to be able to uphold any kind of morality or virtue? And that's exactly the point. It's very interesting because philosophy is often very much focused on ethics, but Camus is very much undermining that idea that there is a structure from which we can build things upon. And I think that that is very much a confrontation with the absurd. Now, the thing that I find amazing about absurdism as a philosophy, not just articulated through Camus, but for example in this book, is this idea that we confront the absurd and things feel very ugly, they feel very unpleasant, they feel very painful and uncomfortable, and yet that's the world we live in. And we try to figure out what to do. And I'll admit, the reason why Camus and absurdism I can identify with, and why it appeals to me, is because I feel as though I feel that way sometimes. I feel like I'm making all of this effort to not be a hypocrite. I feel like I'm making myself, confront reality and not collapse into this idea that it's all pointless and absurd and meaningless. But I very much feel that sometimes. And that's why I think this is such a powerful idea, because it seems to me as though the absurd is everywhere. And it's very interesting because we often want to identify everything as having some kind of metaphysical depth, in a philosophical sense, but also in an intellectual sense. And that's very interesting because sometimes we do just confront that difficult reality that there might not be a reason at all to why things happen. And I think that's very interesting to think about because, yeah, sometimes we can't explain why things happen. Sometimes we don't understand the reason why they happened. Sometimes we don't understand even if we can get through the things that have happened. And in my life personally, I've kind of felt like this isn't necessarily an inspiring philosophy, but I think it is a very truthful philosophy, because I think I've definitely experienced things that were very absurd and that I couldn't explain, but that I had no choice but to deal with. And so my whole take on all of this is that absurdity is everywhere, and we must do our best to be able to understand it, but also realizing that we might not be able to understand it at all. And I think that that's definitely an important thing to keep in mind. So yeah, I'm Phoenix. Thank you for watching, and I will see you soon.